Foundation Module 1, UHS Modular Integrated Undergraduate Curriculum Physiology. Dr. Sheen, CEO and founder, Medical Superfast. Simplified Physiology Video Lecture Notes. Guyton and Hall 14 Edition, Chapter Number 4. Lecture Number 12. Learning Objective. Define and enlist different types of diffusion. Explain the process of facilitated diffusion with the aid of diagram. Define and classify different types of active transport. Describe primary and secondary active transport with examples. Define and enlist different types of diffusion. Transport of various substances through cell membranes may occur by several mechanisms, which includes diffusion, passive transport, subtypes, simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion. Factors that affect net rate of diffusion. Diffusion, passive transport, random molecular movement of substances, molecule by molecule. It occurs through intermolecular spaces in the membrane or in combination with carrier protein. Diffusing energy is the normal kinetic motion of matter. Simple diffusion, kinetic movement of molecules or ions, occurs through a membrane opening or through intermolecular spaces. It does not require a carrier protein. It takes place in two ways. It occurs through the cell membrane or channel protein, watery channels. Lipid-soluble substances like oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen pass easily through the cell membrane. Lipid-insoluble substances like water and various ions diffuse across the cell membrane through transmembrane channels. Water diffuses through cell membrane via aquaporins. Note, keep in mind, passage through ion channels may be controlled by gate-like extensions of the channel protein, and the channels are called gated channels. Facilitated diffusion with aid of diagram. It is also called carrier-mediated diffusion. It occurs down the concentration gradient. Substances have relatively large molecular size. It occurs via specific transmembrane integral proteins. It does not directly require chemical energy from ATP. The rate of diffusion approaches a maximum, limited by the saturation of carrier proteins, called Vmax. It also shows a binding receptor on the inside of the carrier protein. The molecule to be transported enters the pore and becomes bound. Then, in a fraction of a second, a conformational or chemical change occurs in the carrier protein. The pore now opens to the opposite side of the membrane. Attached molecule break away and released on the opposite side of the membrane due to thermal motion. For example, glucose, fructose, galactose, and some vitamins and most of the amino acids. Points to be remember. Insulin promotes uptake of glucose inside cells through glucose transporters, called GLUT4 carrier protein. Increases the number of carrier protein molecules in the cell membrane. Thereby, it increases transport of glucose across cell membrane. Factors that affect net rate of diffusion: amount of substance, velocity of kinetic motion, the temperature, permeability of the cell membrane, thickness of the cell membrane. The greater the thickness, the less the rate of diffusion. Number of protein channels. The number and sizes of openings in the cell membrane through which the molecules or ions can move. Lipid solubility. It is directly proportional to the lipid solubility of the substance. For example, O2, N2, CO2. The small molecules are more permeable than large molecules, e.g., the diameter of the urea molecule is only 20% greater than water. Its penetration through the cell membrane pores is about 1,000 times less than water. Pressure difference across cell membrane. Concentration difference of diffusing substance between two sides of cell membrane. Electrical potential difference between two sides of cell membrane. Surface area. The larger the membrane surface area for diffusion, the faster the diffusion rate. For example, air sacs of the lungs have a large surface area. it directly proportional to the stotal area of the membrane. It is inversely proportional to the size of molecules. Diffusion distance: the greater the distance, the longer it takes. Diffusion across a plasma membrane takes only a fraction of a second because membrane is so thin. In pneumonia, it collects in lungs, so diffusion distance increases. Large amounts of oxygen can be transported to the interior of the cell as the cell membrane is not present. Water is highly insoluble in the membrane lipids. It passes through channels in protein molecules that penetrate the cell membrane. The rapidity with which water molecules can diffuse through most cell membranes is surprising. For example, the total amount of water that diffuses in each direction through the red blood cell membrane during each second is about 100 times as great as the volume of the red blood cell. Cell membranes contain protein pores called aquaporins that allow rapid passage of water through the membrane. Define and classify different types of active transport. Active transport is divided into two types according to the source of the energy used to help the transport. Primary active transport, uphill transport. Secondary active transport, coupled transport. Primary active transport, uphill transport. In this transport, the energy is derived directly from the breakdown of protein or some other high energy phosphate compound. It is carrier-mediated. Examples: sodium, potassium, pump, calcium pump, hydrogen secretion. 2. Secondary active transport. When a substance or an ion is transported across a cell membrane with the movement of another molecule against its concentration or electrochemical gradient, energy is derived from ionic concentration difference created originally by primary active transport. It uses electrochemical energy, not directly ATP, to move molecules. A transporter protein couples the movement of an electrochemical ion, typically sodium or hydrogen, down its electrochemical gradient to the upward movement of another molecule or an ion against a concentration or electrochemical gradient. Examples: co-transport, membrane transport of glucose and amino acids with sodium in the same direction. Counter-transport, membrane transport of sodium and calcium with sodium in opposite directions. Describe primary and secondary active transport with examples. Primary and secondary active transport mechanisms are both very important for moving substances across cell membranes against their concentration gradients, but they operate differently. Brief overview of primary and secondary active transport with examples. Primary active transport directly uses energy in the form of ATP or some other high-energy phosphate compound to transport molecules across a cell membrane. This process moves substances from areas of low concentration to high concentration against the natural flow. Examples of primary active transport: sodium-potassium pump, sodium-potassium ATPase. It is a transporter that pumps potassium ions outside through the cell membrane of all cells, and at the same time pumps K+ ions from the outside. Calcium pump, calcium ATPase. It is also an example of primary active transport. Calcium ions are normally maintained at an extremely low concentration in the intracellular cytosol of all cells in the body, 10,000 times less than that in the ECF. This level is achieved by two primary active transport pumps. One, in the cell membrane, pumps calcium to the outside of the cell. The other pumps calcium ions into sarcoplasmic reticulum of muscle cells and the mitochondria in all cells. The carrier protein penetrates the membrane and functions as an enzyme ATPase to break ATP. Primary active transport of hydrogen ions. 1. In the gastric glands of the stomach. The deep-lying parietal cells transport hydrogen ions of any part of the body. This mechanism is the basis for secreting HCl in stomach digestive secretions. 2. In the late distal tubules and cortical collecting ducts of the kidneys, found intercalated cells also transport hydrogen ions. In this case, large amounts of hydrogen ions are secreted from the blood into the renal tubular fluid for removing excess hydrogen ions from the body fluids. Hydrogen ions secreted into the renal tubular fluid against a concentration gradient of about 900-fold. Most of these hydrogen ions combine with tubular fluid buffers before they are removed in the urine. Secondary active transport with examples. CoO, transport and countertransport. It uses the energy produced by moving another molecule across the cell membrane. When sodium ions are transported out of cells by primary active transport, KOO, transport, a large concentration gradient of sodium ions across the cell membrane develops with a high concentration outside the cell and a low concentration inside. This gradient difference represents a storehouse of energy. Excess sodium outside the cell membrane is always tried to diffuse to the inside. This diffusion energy of sodium can pull other substances along with the sodium through the cell membrane. In this process, carrier protein is involved. The transport carrier protein has two binding sites on its outside, one for sodium and one for glucose. When they both attached, the conformational change takes place, and the sodium and glucose are transported to the inside of the cell at the same time. Sodium TO, transport of amino acids, occurs in the same manner as for glucose, except that it uses a different set of transport proteins. Sodium CoO transport of glucose and amino acids occurs through the epithelial cells of the intestinal tract and the renal tubules of the kidneys to promote absorption of these substances into the blood. Other important KOO transport mechanisms include KOO transport of potassium, chloride, bicarbonate, phosphate, iodine, iron, and urate ions. Sodium counter, transport of calcium and hydrogen ions. Two important countertransporters, example, transport in a direction opposite to the primary ion, are sodium, calcium counter, transport, and sodium, hydrogen counter, transport. It occurs through all cell membranes, with sodium ions moving to the inside and calcium ions to the outside, both bound to the same transport protein in a counter, transport mode. Sodium-hydrogen countertransport occurs in several tissues. Proximal tubules of the kidney, where sodium ions move from the lumen of the tubule to the interior of the tubular cell, while hydrogen ions are countertransported into the tubular lumen.